Right, I think we're about ready to go. So a very, very warm welcome to the opening lecture in our autumn digital engagement series, Fall into Nature. And over the coming month, we have 27 opportunities for you to engage in lectures, talks, art workshops on all things related to do with plants. And this evening, I'm delighted to be joined by Jonathan Drori CBE for our talk on Around the World in 80 Plants and why plant conservation is a truly international effort. My name is Ian Dunn and I'm the Chief Executive of Plantlife. And I'm going to introduce John first and foremost by holding up this wonderful plant, which John will be both talking from and reading from this evening. And I would also encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to look at John's first book, which was Around the World in 80 Trees. And I found both of them utterly compelling. So John is a trustee of the Eden Project and the Cambridge Science Centre. He's an ambassador for WWF, and for 9 years was a trustee of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and the Woodland Trust. So quite a stellar range of organisations. He's on the board of the Cambridge University Botanic Gardens. And in fact, in a talk earlier today, I was asked about my favourite plant, and I chose the jade vine because the colour of the jade vine, which I've only ever saw in the Cambridge Botanic Gardens, was just extraordinary. John is a fellow of the Linnaean Society, the Zoological Society of London, and the Royal Geographical Society. In previous life, he was at the BBC. He was the executive producer of more than 50 primetime science documentaries and popular series. So it's just great that John's been able to join us this evening. And I'm going to take there's so many good things in John's book, but I'm going to take just one sentence before I just talk through how this evening is going to work. And one of the sentences that John has written is often beautiful, sometimes deadly, but constantly ingenuous. Plants are the sources of life and the light of myth and mayhem. And we're going to share some of that with you this evening. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Please do raise any questions. If you've got any questions, use the Q&A. What we'll also be doing is put some things into the chat. So we'll be giving you some links. We'll be giving you some, there might be a few technical things. If you've got any technical issues, use the chat. We'll then come to the questions and answers later on in the talk. And probably John and I will spend about 40 minutes or so on our global tour, and then we'll move into some questions and answers. So we're trying something a little bit different this evening. I hope it's going to be a lot of fun. I hope you're going to really enjoy it. But effectively what's going to happen is that I'm going to introduce the starting geography. And I was asked to also bring a little bit of personal flavor into it. So I've chosen countries with plants from John's book that means something very much to me and enable us to go on this wonderful global tour. So I hope you enjoy it and look forward to your questions as well. So I'm going to start in the UK, of course, and I'm going to just pop my background onto blur just so it's not a distraction. And off we go. So I'm starting this evening's tour in the UK, and I'm actually going to be starting with sphagnum moss. And I've chosen sphagnum moss because it's a hugely important genus. It comprises about 380 species, and it is so successful that it is a significant habitat forming moss. It forms the blanket bogs, it forms the peat bogs. And for those of you who've had some interaction with Plantlife, you'll know that the way we are tackling our strategy going forward is to look at the interaction between biodiversity, climate, and social issues. And peat bogs are fundamentally important for climate. There are 34 species in Scotland, and 20 of them are found at our Montserrat Reserve. And now peat bogs can be found across all 4 nations of the UK, and besides being really special habitats with some remarkable plants, as I mentioned, they are very, very important for the fight against climate change. They're a non-vascular plant, and that's why I'm also starting with sphagnum moss. And they stretch far back into the evolutionary journey of plants. They're found across Europe's northern climes, as well as Chile, Argentina, Japan, North America, Australia and New Zealand. All of the nutrients for the growth of sphagnum moss comes from their leaves, none from the roots. And this soft tissue nature of the moss is why there are very, very few fossil records. The oldest one, however, is known to be around about 320 million years old. Now, why else are we choosing with sphagnum? Well, in 1985, I joined a plant survey and collecting expedition alongside the New York Botanic Gardens to the tabletop mountains of the Serra de Neblina on the Brazilian-Venezuelan border. And sphagnum was identified the year afterwards by the New York Botanic Gardens for the very first time in equatorial South America. And I'm going to be coming back to South America later. One of the major plant families, mosses, have the second highest number of species after the flowering plants. And they are found in many challenging environments, including deserts, high mountains, and high latitudes. They play a major role in so many aspects of our world. In our world's ecosystems, they affect mineral flows, affect water fluxes, they control water runoff, erosion, they provide food, habitat for a wide range of organisms, including other plants, fungi, bacteria, invertebrates, birds, and mammals. And we very often forget them. So we're starting today with one of the remnants of perhaps the earliest known branching, or one of the earliest branching events in the radiation of plants on the planet. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to John.
Thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen. What could possibly go wrong? I'm hoping that you can see my screen and even a little highlighter laser thingy. Does that work?
Yes, that all works. Yep.
Great. So hello, everyone. It's absolutely lovely to be here supporting Plantlife. What a fantastic organization. And I think Ian really deserves a big kind of intro, like you so generously gave me, Ian. But my responses to Ian about each plant will comprise sort of 3-minute chunks with a few pictures, some commentary, a few short readings from the book. And here and there, you'll see illustrations from the book by the wonderful Lucille Clark. Please forgive my clumsy juggling of buttons if I need to do so as we go, but I think I'm going to try and share screen all the way through. So sphagnum. Rarely reaching even ankle height, sphagnum is the unassuming principal architect of the peat bog, a serenely beautiful habitat and one of the world's most important ecosystems. Across the Arctic and subarctic northern hemisphere, in waterlogged places where rain is frequent and can't drain away, sphagnum species create a moist mantle in colours drawn from a surprisingly wide palette. Muted greens and subdued shades of russet, copper and chocolate are dotted with bright patches of warm pinks, oranges, and even yellow. Of ancient lineage and lacking even the basic plumbing that more evolved plants use to transport water and nutrients, sphagnum has no use for roots. Only the top is alive. The bedraggled brown part underneath is quite dead. There are especially fine peat bogs in Scotland and Ireland. In fact, the English word bog is from a Gaelic root meaning soft, moist, and steeping. Hardly a surprise to the hikers who squelch across its hummocks and thick floating mats. Sphagnum's ability to trap and absorb water is prodigious. Its feathery little leaf-like structures hold rainwater like a sponge, and within the body of the plant, special retort cells are perforated with pores that enable dry sphagnum rapidly to absorb 20 times its own volume in water. So sphagnum has no blossom. It reproduces with tiny spores in very, very tiny capsules, just a millimetre or two across. And those are a quarter filled with spores, about 250,000 in each one, and the rest is air. And there's some amazing sort of Lilliputian little kind of air gun mechanism for launching those spores. And as the capsules dry, they shrink, building up the pressure until suddenly they rupture and the spores emerge as a coherent bundle, which helps them go further, riding on a kind of vortex, like a horizontal smoke ring, at about 70 miles an hour. And that's enough to get up to about 8 inches where they can catch the breeze. And on a hot summer day, the clicking sound from a sphagnum bog is a kind of audible miracle, I think. Sphagnum manipulates its environment to suit itself while sabotaging competitors. And it creates areas of very stagnant water, starved of dissolved oxygen, and it extracts more dissolved nutrients than it needs for its own survival and sort of sequesters them away, leaving precious little for others. And it has this cunning chemistry that makes bog water very acidic indeed. And microorganisms don't like it, won't live in it. For that reason, things won't decay. And among the things that won't decay are bodies that have fallen in there. So this is Tolland Man, 2,400 years old, in Denmark. So well preserved that he was actually, when he was first found, thought to be a recent murder victim. Even his fingerprints survived. Absolutely extraordinary. And sphagnum has those special cells that I mentioned that retain liquids. And during the First World War, it was used for surgical dressings and sanitary towels. Very, very absorbent, remarkably sterile, of course. And there were moss drives for the war effort in the United Kingdom and Canada. Millions of dressings were used each month during the war. That's moss. Back to you, Ian, and let me know if I need to stop screen sharing.
That's great, thank you. So where to next? Well, we're going to go south, and then we're going to go east, and then we're going to go west. So we're next heading down to Iran. And often in the news for the wrong reasons. Iran, nevertheless, has a remarkable cultural heritage, as you know. And by the 5th century BC, the Persian Empire was the largest the world had ever seen. And it spanned from Egypt in the west to the Indus River in the east. And in 2005, I was fortunate enough in one of the moments where the relationships with Iran and the rest of the world were slightly perhaps easier. I was able to visit Iran, and I went to Iran from Saudi Arabia and from Riyadh. With all of its restrictions and all of the gender inequality, which was just in front of you. And I was utterly taken by the beauty of the country, by the openness of its people, in fact, by the openness of society. And at the time, compared to Riyadh, certainly, the seeming full engagement of women across all aspects of at least secular society. So my introduction to Iran was far, far more positive than I perhaps could ever have imagined. Now, from a plant point of view, an extraordinary diverse country, diversity in terms of climate, in terms of soils, in terms of geological formations. We think that the country probably has about 8,000 species of plants, and a quarter of them are endemic. And endemic means that they are not found anywhere else. And I'll reference that a little bit in terms of our international journey today. So the main ecosystem types found in Iran are desert, forest, and their rangeland covers about half of the country. And rangeland is land which is available for grazing, but it's not heavily grazed and it's generally not wooded. The altitudes range from about 38 meters below sea level on the shores of the Caspian Sea up to 5,500 meters above sea level at the summit of Mount Damavand. The climate equally varies significantly, with averages temperatures varying up to 30 Celsius at any given time. And due to this variation in climate, in altitude, in ecosystem types, there's this enormous variety of species right across the country, with many only found in a particular region or in a ecosystem type. Now, this has led to the designation of the Irano-Anatolian region as a World Heritage Site, and it's one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. It covers nearly 1 million kilometers, and most of that is actually found within Iran. The Hyrcanian forest stretches almost 1,000 kilometers along the Caspian Sea, and the best estimates are it's between 25 and 50 million years old. So although it covers only 7% of Iran's landmass, it actually holds something like 44% of the species that are found there. And finally, in the Zagros Mountains, it holds nearly 60% of Iran's alpine flora, and most of which are endemic, and in fact 700 of those species have only ever been recorded once in the entire history of botanical surveying of Iran. So it's a remarkable country, and John's going to take us through one of the remarkable plants there.
Yeah, so I'd like to tell you about Asafoetida. or Devil's Dunn. This is one of the lovely illustrations by Lucille Clerc in the book. It's a rather lovely plant, Asafoetida, of the area that Ian's been talking about. Very sturdy, easily my height, so, you know, can grow 6 foot high, with stems as thick as my fist. Lovely bursts of flowers, as you can see, like fireworks, as big as a cauliflower. You might know it from northern Indian cookery. It's the sort of gooey, gummy, resiny exudation from the roots that hardens in the air. And I have to say, it's pretty unpleasant stuff. It has a really appalling smell, which is a combination to me of something like sort of garlic and sweat and old socks and maybe a bit of meat on the turn. But fry it in a little butter and there's a remarkable transformation. It's a sort of joyfully warm, savory umami aroma that kind of knits together all the other spices in Indian food, especially North Indian food. It's a very common commodity in India known as hing. And it's used in Ayurvedic medicine as a digestive and for various respiratory and nervous complaints. It's probably particularly good in lentil and chickpea dishes because it seems to have a sort of anti-flatulent property. But I want to tell you about a plant that we think is a very, very close relative of Asafoetida, and it's called silphium. Silphium was an absolutely quintessential seasoning in Greek and Roman cuisine. And they loved it and they put it in absolutely everything. It was the kind of soul food, the chicken soup of Greece and Rome. I'd love to show you a photo of silphium, but I can't because it's extinct. The best images we have are on coins like this one from Cyrenaica, which is the present day strip along the Libyan coast, the Mediterranean coast of Libya. Apparently that was the only place that it grew. And though the Romans unsuccessfully tried to cultivate it in all sorts of other places, it was incredibly popular in Roman cuisine and they imported it all from this one place. And so for hundreds of years, supply was very, very tightly controlled, which meant that there were high prices, but also it ensured that the harvest was sustainable. But then there was a kind of disaster, and it wasn't a natural disaster at all, but a management disaster. And I think it's got a lesson for us all, because the Romans started appointing governors on temporary placements. And those people, those new governors, overexploited this plant for short-term gain. And before long, Pliny the Elder complained that silphium was getting hard to come by. They substituted Asafoetida, which is the plant we started with, from Persia, which is now Iran, which was similar to silphium, but sort of inferior. And eventually, silphium became so rare that Julius Caesar held stocks of it in the treasury alongside silver and gold. And it was probably extinct by the end of the 2nd century or so. And there's just one final twist. And I'll read you that. While it lasted, silphium was Cyrenaica's main item of trade. The plant, and occasionally its heart-shaped seed pod, which you can see there, were identifying motifs on its coins. Some historians have claimed that silphium may have been used as an oral contraceptive and would have therefore been regarded as an aphrodisiac. In such a light, it's hard to resist looking at the heart symbol with a modern eye and wondering whether more than 2,000 years ago, it was a shape that might already have been associated with love. In more recent times, silphium's probable sibling, Asafoetida, has been used from Arabia to India as a sexual stimulant. Given its odor, its users must have a strong belief in its efficacy. Back to you, Ian.
Thank you, John. Well, we're next from the Middle East, and of course, where else logically, given the trade winds and the great trade routes, but down to Africa, the cradle of humanity. And here we had almost endless choices to think about, but we've chosen to go to Cameroon, of course, on the west coast. So, what does Africa evoke to you? Well, to me, it's big skies, it's amazing habitats. It's extraordinary species, and in many ways, it's a continent which is in fact beyond superlatives. It is just astonishingly diverse. Population of Africa today around about 1.2 billion people. It's very likely, by all estimates, to top out at around about 4 billion. So the pressures on African habitats are going to be quite extraordinary. Now, my best man happened to be from Zimbabwe, and we visited parts of Africa down in 1997. And really, I've had an ongoing relationship with parts of Africa since then. My wife and I, we set up a charity for HIV positive abandoned street kids in Tanzania. And today this continues to be a thriving, self-funded small charity, which has now a small primary school. It works with women to establish them in micro business in the villages, and it teaches skills for the farming both of subsistence crops and of some cash crops. So back to Cameroon. On the Atlantic coast, West Africa, it ranges from the lush rainforests of the active volcano, which is Mount Cameroon, which is about 4,000 meters high, and it has the highest rainfall in Africa. So that can be 8 meters or so per year. And it stretches all the way up to the arid sub-Saharan bushlands at the extreme north of Lake Chad. So the hot and humid south supports really dense rainforests in which hardwood evergreen trees grow, and that includes the mahogany, it includes ebony. And in fact, some of those, both of those, particularly the mahogany, can grow up over to 260 meters tall. So that's about 1.5 times St. Paul's. There are a large number of orchids and ferns. Mangroves grow along the coasts and along the mouths of rivers. And as the rainforest gives way to the semi-deciduous forest in the central region, and then to the wooded savanna in the further north, there are great changes in its plant ecosystems, as you can imagine. Now, what's really special about Cameroon as well is that many of the national food dishes derive from indigenous plants there. Fibers are used, and traditional medicines are very, very important still culturally. So far, again, around about 8,000 plant species have been identified, and that list grows every year. But the number of threatened species is vastly higher as well than almost any other country in Africa, and probably any other country globally. And that's because of rapid clearance of endemic species-rich habitat, particularly the lowland rainforests and the submontane cloud forest. So we are losing species before we even know about them. And as in many parts of Africa, the main threats are expansions of plantations, open cast mining, hydroelectric dams, flooding areas, illegal and unsustainable logging, followed by extensive small-holding agricultural expansion. So Plantlife's partner, the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, are working with the National Herbarium of the Cameroon and the University of Yaoundé to identify important plant areas in the Cameroon as a practical way to identify and prioritize areas for conservation. And important plant areas were established under metrics that Plantlife put together with Kew, and those metrics still hold true globally wherever we can identify important plant areas. So far, we've identified 41 in the Cameroon that we would like to be working on. And we have a webinar on Monday, in fact, Monday lunchtime, where if you'd like to join us, you can hear more about the tropical IPAs of the Cameroon and the conservation efforts that we are undertaking to protect them. John.
Thank you. So one of my favorite plants of Cameroon, also Gabon, that kind of area of West Africa, is iboga. It's again, lovely drawings here by Lucille Clerc. It's a forest understory shrub, lovely little white trumpet flowers streaked with pink. The petals curl back on themselves. I don't know if you can see that. And the fruits are these lovely orange, pale orange ovals, the size of an apricot. The main event, though, are actually the twigs of iboga. Now, the plants, like many plants, have latex that defend themselves, and it sort of gums up the mouth parts of insects and sometimes poisons them and so on. Lots of plants have latex, dandelions, rubber, and so on. This one is quite evil smelling, and it's used as a component of arrow poison. The stems and roots contain a drug called ibogaine, and various other mind-altering drugs, and it's appallingly bitter. It's ground up, mixed with honey, and taken, of course, as an aphrodisiac. Everything seems to be. It's also used by hunters as a stimulant, so they can remain alert. But unlike with caffeine, they can stay silent and still, which is quite a clever thing. but larger doses of ibogaine are used in the initiation rites of the Bwiti cult, which is an interesting synthesis of West African traditions with a spot of Catholicism thrown in. And the purpose is to sort of develop courage and patience and humility. And there are various rituals that happen over the course of a year or more. People have faces caked in ash, and along with the sort of community that dances in support, initiates experience this sort of eerie phase of anxiety and nausea and a sort of feeling of not being quite present. And apparently it kind of rekindles memories of early life, and that sort of connects the initiates with ancestors and gives a glimpse of the future, so that they feel part of a continuum. And like all drug taking, whether it's sort of alcohol in our culture, context is absolutely everything. So ibogaine as a drug is illegal in many countries, but it is now being explored by doctors and pharmaceutical companies in Europe and the US for a surprisingly rapid treatment of heroin addiction, which is ironic, really. Very, very promising outcomes. A lot of scientific papers being published at the moment. Back to you, Ian.
Right, thank you, John. We're going east, and again we're following trade routes, and we're heading towards India, as you might imagine, an extraordinary country, an extraordinary subcontinent. And I'm sure for those of you who've managed and been lucky enough to visit there, it never fails to fascinate, to engage, and probably to exhaust all at the same time. And I had one of life's privileges was to have the chance to see tigers in the wild in the open forest of Ranthambore National Park. Whilst at the same time, when you visit India, you become immersed in the throngs of Mumbai, the smells and the richness of life. Whilst also having opportunity to experience the tranquility that comes from the Taj Mahal at sunset. So it's another incredible, amazing country. It's roughly 330 million hectares, so it's big. 7,500 kilometers of coastline, and a huge range of ecosystems, right from the tropical evergreen rainforests in the northeast and the Western Ghats. It's got the mangroves of the Sundarbans. And of course, it's got the highest mountain range in the world with the Himalayas. And in the Himalayas, of course, you've got extraordinarily cold, very arid climate, but you've actually also got some very hot and very arid around the perhaps the lowlands around the Himalayas. So it's this diversity of ecosystems that has made India one of the world's 17 mega diverse countries. And roughly it holds around about 6% of all flowering species. Now, the biodiversity hotspots in India are particularly in the northeast, as I've mentioned, and the Andaman Islands. It's around the Western Ghats, Nicobar Island and the Sunderlands, and the Eastern Himalayas. And the significance of these areas stems not just from the number of floristic species, which is, as you'd expect, to be quite high, but also from the exceptionally high number of endemics there. So these species that are only found in one place. And now the Sundarbans, and many of you will know about mangrove forest, but the Sundarbans is the world's largest mangrove ecosystem. It's around about 10,000 square kilometers, a huge area. It stretches from the west coast of India across to Bangladesh, and is another of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. As we look at the next two countries, and John touched upon some of the medicinal and some of the behavioral altering properties in the Cameroon, but India has an extraordinary range of medicinal plants, and something like 7,000 of India's 18,000 known flowering species are used for medicinal purposes. They're used in all kinds of health systems. They're used in Ayurveda, they're used in yoga, they're used in Unani, in Siddha, and widely used in homeopathy. And the Himalayan region where Plantlife has worked quite extensively in the past is particularly rich in medicinal plants. And we think it contains around about 1,700 medicinal plants. Now, many of the real benefits of these plants is not yet fully understood. Around about 100 of them are already threatened, and 7 of them are critically endangered. So to protect some of these really valuable plant species, we've identified 15 important plant areas. They are particularly where we have belief in strong medicinal plants being present. And as mentioned before, they're particularly in the eastern and western Himalayas. Most of the IPAs we've identified are found in alpine and subalpine zones. And that reflects just this combination of very high number of species and the very high number of endemic species at these relatively high altitudes. John, over to you.
Thank you. So one of my absolute favorite plants is the lotus. An evolutionary relic from more than 100 million years ago. One of its closest living relatives, well, the closest relatives are probably the proteas of South Africa, with their outrageous blooms. But surprisingly, another close relative is the plane tree, the London plane tree. Now, it's just got a fabulous flower that makes anyone who's grown up in South or Southeast Asia go all kind of misty-eyed. And just about all parts are edible and actually rather good. So it grows in water, often quite murky water. The seed head looks disturbingly like a shower head. And there's an amazing underwater sort of breathing system for the roots. But what I really like about the lotus is the way that it cleans its leaves. Now, water globules, as you probably know, have surface tension. You know that there's this tendency that water has to form globules because of something called molecular cohesion. And those globules on the right kind of surface can sloosh about the leaf and sweep up all the dust and gruck and detritus whenever it rains. Now, it works on this sort of, this is a scanning electron microscope picture, I hope you can see, of these little dimples on the surface. This is nanoscale stuff. Cause the water never to be able to completely spread out and properly wet the surface, so it keeps in this sort of globule. And it's actually called the lotus effect, and the inspiration for all sorts of man-made materials that that shrug off grime and can't be wetted. Now, in Hinduism, the goddess Lakshmi, who you can see here, is depicted couched on a lotus flower, and she's also holding lotus blossoms. And this denotes not only wealth and fertility, but is also, you know, and now you can see why, a symbol of purity. And for Buddhists, well, let me read you. In Buddhism, by tradition, lotus plants sprouted in the first footsteps of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and a common mantra among Tibetan Buddhists, Om Mani Padme Hum, draws together the lotus with enlightenment and inestimable worth in one hypnotically repeated Sanskrit phrase. The lotus, perfect and unsullied by the muddy waters in which it grows, with glittering beads of water that dance and sparkle jewel-like in the center of its leaves, symbolizes the spiritual journey towards light and wisdom. Back to you, Ian.
Thank you. So we're going to China, as you might imagine. And the first time I visited China was just when it was beginning to open up, and around about 1985, I think it was. And what struck us, besides the sheer number of bicycles and the predominance of the green and the blue Mao suits at the time, was when we visited the markets and when you walked around some of the community shops. There was just an extraordinary range of medicinal plants which one had just never come across before. And the more I've learned about the perhaps cultural differences between some of the West and some of the East, you just have this completely different health system, this understanding of how the body works, a very holistic approach to medicine. And that, of course, stems from also an extraordinary plant biodiversity. So China is, as you might imagine, another one of the world's 17 mega diverse countries, and it contains around about 10% of all known plant species. There are 36 of these biodiversity hotspots around the world. China has 4 of them, one in the northwest, one in the tropical south. In the subtropical south, actually, is also one, and then across the Qinghai Tibet plateau. And that particular plateau is the world's highest and the largest plateau. The most recent edition of the Flora of China, which is a truly comprehensive study of Chinese flora, estimates a total of just under 40,000 species of vascular plants in the country, of which about half of them are only found in China. So it gives you a sense of this extraordinary diversity of plants, which is fundamental to many of the very strong cultural elements of Chinese life. One of the most striking displays of biodiversity is actually found in the southwest mountainous regions. And here it's around about 40% of all of that 40,000 species are found there. And that's about a quarter of the world's rhododendron species. And many of those are found in the Hengduanshan Mountains, with some of them growing as high as 20 meters. Now, we also believe at the moment this extraordinary development in China, which I've seen over the last 25 years. We now believe that around about 5,000 of China's vascular plants are threatened, and many of them are becoming quite critically endangered because of human activities. Just going to flip back to the medicinal plants, essential to China for millennia. Again, just sort of throwing some numbers out, we think there are around about 10,000 species which are used for traditional medicine. If you think how many drugs we're using in the Western world at the moment, and then think about 10,000 species, all with their own chemical compounds used in Chinese medicine. Roughly a third of these we think are threatened, and about 400 of these on the most endangered red list. Now, not only are these important medicinal plants, but they're really important for many communities. In some parts of China, the sale of collected medicinal plants still makes up for 80% of people's incomes. The Tibet Plateau, the Hengduan Mountains, two particular areas where there's this extraordinary diversity of medicinal plants. There are 6 large proposed areas which we believe should be and could be important plant areas. And we're working with the Kunming Institute of Botany to try and establish some protection around some of these areas. And on that, it's over to John.
Thank you. Incidentally, just before I talk about the, excuse me, the ginkgo, there's been recent work done on a compound called artemisinin, which is the basis of a lot of anti-malarial drugs now. And that work started in China by a woman who won the Nobel Prize actually for it. She was inspired by an 1800-year-old text about sort of Chinese medicine, which seemed to have sort of chemicals in it that were had anti-fever properties, and someone sort of interpreted this. And anyway, they've done work on artemisinin, which comes from a plant which we know as or is very similar to a plant we know as wormwood, which is where you get absinthe from. Anyway, the ginkgo, absolutely glorious tree, exists in the wild only in the southwest mountains of southwest China in one very tiny area. It has cones, but it's deciduous, and it loses these very distinctive fan-shaped leaves, you know, every autumn, and they shed simultaneously. And I hope you can see, my screen's gone rather strange, but I hope you can see that, you know, the fantastic layer of leaves there. And as they shed, they also create these fluorescent chemicals. So it's a sort of incredibly dazzling experience. Luckily, though, the plant, because it's associated with longevity, is planted and protected in monasteries in China, Korea, and in Japan. And the loss would have been a complete disaster because this plant had already evolved about 200 million years ago. And it's the only living member of a whole division of plants. I mean, a division is like the conifers or the flowering trees and so on. You know, I mean, this is an enormous proportion of the world's plants were once the ginkgo kind of type. And they died out with the dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. Absolutely extraordinary thing. Now, ginkgos can be male or female, and they're an odd mixture of conifer and something much more primitive. And the pollen carries on the wind from little catkin-like cones on the male tree. And it lands on tiny sort of droplets of liquid on the ovules of the female tree. And the pollen is drawn inside, and after a few weeks bursts open to release, get this, swimming sperm. So this tree has swimming sperm about 1/10 of a millimeter across. And the seeds develop into sort of little, they get fleshy coats like mini apricots. They smell of dog poo and vomit, pretty horrible. And plant nurseries, for that reason, avoid female trees. And the seed kernels, once they're washed and roasted, are rather nice. But they look like large pistachios, but don't go and overdo it, because they contain imaginatively named ginkgo toxin, and more than a handful in one go, and you'll get dizzy and have tummy upsets and so on. But absolutely amazing, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful tree. Over to you.
Thanks. So from China, well, where do we go? There's a very strong theory that in the middle of the second millennium, lots of discussion when exactly, the emperors at the time were hugely expansive minded and were sending out large flotillas from China to explore the wider world. And that changed after a period of time when China started looking inwards. And that's when you started to get the building of the Great Wall of China and the great canal systems within China. But prior to that, they were in a very exploratory mode. And there's a theory that when Magellan sailed down to South America, he actually knew where he was going. So the Straits of Magellan had already been identified by some of these Chinese trips. And there was a map found in Goa just around about 10 years, 15 years before Magellan actually sailed down to the bottom of South America, which seemed to show where the straits were. So we are logically going from China down to South America. And again, South America, very close to my heart. Have lived there twice. And there are so many places again, and there's so many plants that we might have selected for this part of our journey. We've actually gone for Bolivia. We've gone for Bolivia because it's one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. Not as many species as China and India, as you can imagine, but it's got around about 15,000 identified species. It's that central portion of South American continent. It lost its coastal area to Chile in one of the many battles. So it's a landlocked country, but it's 5 times the size of the UK. And it has this huge variety of ecoregions. It's got the high plains up in the Andes. It's got the dry Andean valleys. It's got the llanos on the slopes of the Andes. It's then got extensive subtropical savanna. And it's got very interesting and very ancient Amazon rainforest in the eastern part of the country. And along with parts of Ecuador, it's part of the Amazon rainforest which probably survived the last glacial maximum. So it has this extraordinary diversity. So Bolivia has plants which are actually representative of every single climatic zone. On the high plateau, you get this very coarse bunch grass called ichu. And that's used for pasture, it's used for thatching, it's used for weaving mats. Lake Titicaca is believed to be the original home of the potato. And its local communities harvest a reed called totora for making their fishing boats. They're very iconic fishing boats. In the tropical forests, you get the quinine producing. John was talking about malaria and some of the advances in treating malaria now. The classic original treatment for malaria was quinine, and that comes from the quina tree, which is growing in Bolivia. The rubber tree similarly grows in amongst 2,000 hardwood species. And I could go on. They have vanilla, they have saffron. Bolivia is famous for its palms, its sweet potatoes, its manioc, its peanuts, and an astonishing variety of fruits that just never make it across to our markets. There are very large areas of Bolivia which have not been thoroughly surveyed, and where many new species to science are predicted to be discovered. Many areas are being severely impacted at the moment as human activities move into them. And in some of the lower lands of Bolivia, there's intensive soybean farming. There's increasingly intensive cattle farming as much as you can in that part of the world. And in fact, they've got quite rich gas and oil reserves as well. So the Bolivian Natural History Museum are working with Kew and with Plantlife to identify the most fragile and biodiverse areas of parts of Bolivia, and particularly the Bolivian Cinquitano forest. Is a very important tropical important plant area. Monday lunchtime's webinar will also be covering some of that work we do with Kew in Bolivia. But on that note, I'm handing over to John.
Thank you. So I'd like to talk about amaranth, which is one of those trendy grains you get in health food stores nowadays. This is something that's well known in Bolivia and also in Peru. And I'm going to read you a little. Gawky, chest-high Amaranthus caudatus is grown for its seed and leaves in small village plots across the highlands of Argentina, Peru, and Bolivia. It is one of a handful of amaranth species domesticated more than 5,000 years ago in Mexico, Central America, and the Andes. Drought-tolerant and disease-resistant, the plant became a staple food of the Inca and Aztec empires, cultivated using a sophisticated infrastructure of irrigation canals and terracing, the remains of which still survive. The broad, deeply veined leaves of amaranth are fine eating. Cooked in the same way as spinach, their taste is reminiscent of artichoke, and for a leafy vegetable, they contain a surprising amount of protein, along with plenty of vitamins, iron, and fiber. Amaranth inflorescences are agreeably scruffy, pendulous tassels that hang in ragged clusters, each one bearing myriad miniature maroon or blood red flowers. They're followed by prolific cream, gold, or pink seeds, easily 50,000 to a plant, hardly bigger than pinheads, and shaped like tiny flying saucers. The seeds are nutritionally excellent, a complement to cereal grains, with about a third more protein than wheat, but also plenty of lysine, an essential amino acid that wheat lacks. Now, long before the Spanish conquest, soali, a dough made from amaranth flour and agave syrup, was ceremonially molded into figures representing deities such as Quetzalcoatl, the god of wisdom and the arts, and the rain god Tlaloc. With beans and seeds to represent eyes and teeth, the idols were eaten communally at religious feasts to ward off disease, for collective purification, and especially so that by ingesting the flesh of the gods, believers would be imbued with their force and essence. To the invading Spaniards, these rites had an uncomfortable resonance with the Catholic tradition of Holy Communion. While a few Spanish priests and missionaries believed or wanted to believe that the Aztec communion was proof that elements of Christianity were being adopted by indigenous people, most saw the practice as the work of the devil, and it was outlawed, along with the cultivation of amaranth, which took nearly 500 years to begin to recover. Today, the spirit of theophagy, God eating, lives on in the palatable street snack known in Peru as turrones, and in Mexico as alegría, or happiness, which is made by heating popped and usually dyed amaranth seed with syrup or molasses. In the Mexican tradition, alegría is molded into skulls and figurines, especially for the Day of the Dead and other festivals that integrate Christianity with indigenous traditions. See the parallel with the wheaty culture that I mentioned. Back to you, Ian.
So when John and I were deciding how we wanted to close our global tour this evening, we landed on the oceans, and many of the linkages we've been talking about today have come from the oceans. If you think about the spice trade and the value of plants, as John has covered in some of the ones he selected, they were extraordinarily powerful drivers of human activity. They fundamentally changed economies. They completely changed some of the movement of people. So we thought, well, what a nice way to finish with phytoplankton as part of the oceans. And John will cover the extraordinary abundance and importance of them, truly on a planetary scale, and relevant for all life, not just in the oceans, but also on land. But my last anecdote from my global tour this evening was actually, again, 30 years ago on our honeymoon. I had the opportunity to go night fishing with friends of my wife from college in the Straits of Malacca, and it's that strait between the peninsula of Malaysia and the island of Sumatra. And it was a tropical night. It was inky dark, and as we motored out some way from the shore, I was a little bit uncertain about this, and I looked behind to see how far from the shore we'd gone, and there was this just remarkable sight, this huge fluorescent green wash as the phytoplankton were responding to the movement of the boat. there was an electric storm, and I can visualize it very clearly. There's an electric storm playing out over Sumatra, and there was no moon. And my fun-loving friends were varying either high speed or in fact zero speed, as the propeller was getting caught up in broken and discarded fishing tackle, which you couldn't see in the dark. And this was very poignant in so many ways, and it was quite, I think, important for me to, in my journey, to finish on this, because that allowed me plenty of time not only to observe this extraordinary natural phenomenon, which I had not come across before, and to see it for the first time, and it was simply magnificent. But it was also the first time I really experienced the way that our oceans, our lungs, and our climate moderator were being used as a global garbage bin. And the problem is far, far more extensive now than it was those 30 years ago. Now, I don't want to finish on a gloomy note in terms of that tour, because the experience of the phytoplankton was truly extraordinary. And John's just going to share a final thought from his book about phytoplankton.
Thank you, Ian. It's interesting, we both had the same sort of reaction to phytoplankton, though you and I have very sort of have come at this with our different experiences. So this is the final reading. Microscopic single-celled organisms may not fit everyone's definition of a plant, but a plant's most important capability is to photosynthesize, and phytoplankton certainly do that. Most of them live for just a few days, drifting on ocean currents, suspended near the surface where there's light. Using sunshine to power the process, phytoplankton consume carbon dioxide dissolved in seawater and incorporate carbon compounds into their tiny bodies, just as carbon is stored by the wood and leaves of a tree. They may be small, but they're abundant. A tablespoon of seawater may contain hundreds of thousands of individuals. Together, the world's marine phytoplankton absorb as much carbon dioxide and give off as much oxygen as all the trees and every other land plant combined. They're also the ocean's primary producers, the first link in the food chain. Without them, hardly any other sea life would be possible. Phytoplankton are typically the width of a fine hair, but can be much smaller. Magnification reveals a parallel universe of intricate structures, the stuff of acid dreams, solitary spaceships and implausibly geometric shapes, minute snakes and ladders, and garlands of elaborate beads on infinitesimal threads. There are thousands of different species. Some phytoplankton can even create light through a chemical process called bioluminescence, which may have evolved as a defense mechanism. Incredibly, light generated by the community of phytoplankton and triggered by movement appears to startle predators, while simultaneously attracting larger sea creatures that may see off the would-be attackers. A nocturnal bioluminescent bloom in a warm, smooth sea is one of the most achingly beautiful sights in nature. The experience of swimming in such vastness, engulfed by a luminous, pulsing community, and knowing that individually insignificant phytoplankton are the source of almost all nourishment and life in the ocean, is truly humbling. That's it. Thank you, Ian.
Well, no, thank you very much. Now, we've slightly been longer, and hopefully that's a consequence of the enthusiasm which you hopefully has been conveyed to you. What I'm going to do again is just hold up Jonathan's book. The readings from it, I think somebody put into the chat, really just utterly compelling, and I encourage you to engage with it, frankly, by acquiring it and sharing it, because it is really stunning. We've got a few minutes. Felicity's joined us in case there's any questions, but I've got a really difficult one for John.
Oh no.
Which is
difficult, I'm not going to be able to answer it.
I know. Which is your favorite plant, John? Of all the trees and all the plants you went through in your research to get to the 1880?
Do you know what? The favorite sort of depends on the mood that you're in, and all sorts of personal things. And my favorite plant is the cedar of Lebanon, and it's my favorite because when I was a kid, I grew up in southwest London near Richmond Park, and we used to go and see this fantastic cedar of Lebanon. And I remember once it had been struck by lightning and was being sawn up. It had died, and it was just the saddest thing. And it was the first time I saw my father cry. And there was this sort of big tree that would have been there forever, I thought, and wasn't. And there was my father, who I thought was in benign control of everything, and wasn't. And it was a sort of formative moment for me. I was probably about 6 or 7, and for that reason, I think the cedar of Lebanon is a sort of absolute favourite. And of course, the wood is fantastic and smells great, and it's it's been written about in the oldest story that humankind has, which is written down, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, from 4,500 years ago, on cuneiform tablets. And even then they were talking about the destruction of the cedar forests. So that's my favorite.
Great, well, thank you. Felicity's joined us. Felicity's been behind this whole month of programs, so thank you to Felicity as well. Felicity, is there any final question that you would like to put to John? Just reading the chat, I fully agree about, I think, the comment from Asa about biomimicry. It's an absolutely fascinating area, and I think we can learn a huge amount from it still.
There's an interesting question here. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Sorry, Vichea or Vikea, I'm not sure. But the question is, do you think we should be working more with local communities with their vast knowledge on traditional medicine when exploring new plant compounds? I sort of feel like you're leading the witness here, Milad, but yes, there is a fantastic amount of knowledge that people have built up over over generations and generations and generations, and we're absolutely mad to throw that away. And of course, along with the destruction of habitats and plant habitats goes the destruction of human habitats, and so a lot of that knowledge is being lost. And there are various projects around, that are trying to capture that knowledge while it's still there. But completely agree with the sentiment of your question.
I think.
Yes, sorry, Felicity. I mean, that goes very widely for everybody in plant life as well. And we're very focused on perhaps re-engaging internationally with many indigenous communities, so we can try and capture, try and understand, and try and learn from this incredible depth of knowledge that exists. And we don't do that at our peril. I think it's really important that we embrace all of the knowledge that exists, if nothing else, because it also supports local communities and people in their land and on their land and of their land. And I think it's critical we do that. Felicity, you were going to come in there.
It was following on from Vichea's question, a question here for John. You talked about amaranth as being a sort of superfood stuff. With your knowledge of plants, what do you think the next superfood or superhero for us will be?
Well, I'm not sure. There's a lot of work going on cultivating plants which have a lot of protein and a good balance of proteins. And I see that there are various startup technology companies going into something called water lentil, which or duckweed, as we often call it. I can't remember the Latin name. It's something like Wolfia. I'm not sure. But I think that there'll be a lot of interest in these things that can be, where we can generate a lot of protein and other nutrients at scale. And we'll probably hear more about those. But in the meantime, these things like amaranth and quinoa and so on, I mean, I know they're sort of hip and trendy and people laugh at them, but actually, we depend for half of all our calories on wheat, rice and corn. And that makes us terribly vulnerable. I mean, it's a really sort of daft way to live, because if anything happens to one of those, we're really stuffed. And it's not very good for the environment either to have so little biodiversity in what we eat. So, eating more of these sort of unusual things is generally a good thing to do.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I think, Ian, I've actually got a question for you here that came in. So you took us around the world, and you reflected not only on the beauty of what you were seeing, but also that in many of these places there was habitat destruction going on. Do you think we can work together to stop that?
Well, I think we have to, first and foremost. How we do it and how quickly we can do it is going to be really, really critical. On some days, and John sort of mentioned, it depends how you feel sometimes. On some days I'm hugely optimistic, on other days I'm actually rather sort of pessimistic about how quickly we can tackle some of these great challenges. There is no aspect of conservation or nature which is not fundamentally premised on a healthy plant community, a healthy fungi community, and everything that comes from that, and that includes ourselves. And if you just think about, you know, the oxygen, the food, the fibers, the housing, the medicines, even our hydrocarbons, every aspect of us as animals on the planet and humans depends on a really healthy ecosystem and a really healthy planet. So I don't think we can be asking the question, can we do it? We must do it. We simply must do it. And what we're already seeing to a great extent is, and I think one of the previous questions about local communities was really insightful, because one of the consequences of climate change and nature depletion at the moment is that communities can no longer stay on their land. And if they can't stay on their land, they will move off it. So we are losing productive land. We are going to be forcing very significant migrations of people. And we can actually prevent that if we tackle this combination of climate and nature challenges that we're facing at the moment. So Felicity, we have to do it. We have to fight, and we have to do it at pace, and we have to do it with full recognition of social justice, of much greater equality. So it's quite a large Friday evening challenge.
But you're optimistic.
I am. This evening, I'm optimistic.
I think one of the things that's probably a reflection of mine on this event this evening is the fact that Jonathan and you have come at this, as Jonathan pointed out, from different places. And I found Jonathan's reading from his books really poetic. It really sort of connected with me, as it does, I can see in the chat. Lots of people are off to buy your book, Jonathan. So thank you very much. I think
can I just say that's all very nice, and I'm delighted, really delighted. But if you're not a member of Plantlife and you're not a donor, then you really ought to be. So I'm a friend of Plantlife. I think I'm a life member, but so it's easier for me to say, for goodness sake, folks, give them your money because it's well spent. Become a donor, become a life member. They need you not just because of your money, which is very helpful, and that means they can protect more things and find out more things, but it means that they can have a greater voice the more members they have. So it is a really, really well run, good organization, Plantlife. Just Google it if you need to, Plantlife International. And sign up, encourage other people to as well. Terrific organization. You really want to be part of it.
Great. Well, that wasn't scripted, but it's very, very welcome. And I think, Felicity, that's probably a really good note to finish on. And from all of us at Plantlife, a really big thank you for John for giving up his Friday evening to join us and to kick off a month of what I think will be fascinating talk. So please do get the word out, Fall into Nature, a whole month of interactive, engaging activities. Join us wherever you can, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much.